July 1991 in Jerusalem, my brother and James and I decided that we were going to spend the entire day at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Museum. I don't know why we hadn't visited Yad Vashem on our first visit. Maybe it was because we were busy doing my mum's Bible tour, and obviously the Holocaust isn't in the Bible, so it didn't figure. Literally, the Holocaust did not figure in our first visit of 2 weeks to Israel. Tells you something also about, British society at that time and how prominent, how talked about the Holocaust was, because it never even occurred to my mom to put Yad Vashem on the trip. We went to En Kerem, which is right near there, because there was a story about En Kerem in the Bible. The day that we walked into Yad Vashem, I just need to back up a little bit and tell you what we knew about the Holocaust. We had grown up in post-war Britain. I was born in 1967, 22 years after the end of World War II. World War II was very, very present in British society and narrative. There was hardly a family that wasn't touched by it. And it wasn't so much the bravado of having ultimately prevailed, but there was an element of that. Like, we're all right, Jack. We dug for victory. We did what we had to do in order to win that war. And there were sacrifices made. And somehow that was the prevailing narrative. Quite justifiable. I mean, one can talk about, the war crimes and the bombing of Dresden and all the things, and we should have done more about the Holocaust. I have to say, all of that is very much done from a perspective of distance. When you've got enough distance to be able to process and think about the nuances. You might say, well, the bombing of Dresden wasn't a nuance. At the time it was. It was a case of, are we going to defeat this peril or not? Doesn't justify anything that happened, I'm just saying. Only distance gives you the benefit to look at those things. But distance had not given us the benefit of understanding the severity of the Holocaust. In British society after 1945, there had been a conscious effort to subdue the memory of the Holocaust, partly because a new war had begun, the Cold War, and the Brits needed the Germans, and the last thing they wanted to do was offend them by rubbing their faces in what had happened. There was that. And the War Propaganda Unit, as we know, very quickly shut down documentaries and publications around the Holocaust straight after World War II. I knew at the age of 11, I knew about the dam busters. I knew terms like a Belsen horror. I remember my father once describing me. I was a skinny kid, believe it or not, as a child. I was tiny and skinny. And more than once I was referred to as a Belsen horror because you could count my ribs. So it was in the lingo that there had been this horrific event take place, but really it wasn't in the culture. It certainly wasn't in the historical narrative. I remember reading a book at the age of 11 called, I think it was called My Name is David or I Am David. It was actually a book about a child in a concentration camp. But somehow at the end of reading that book as an 11-year-old, I still didn't know about the Holocaust. Because it was so, one of those early fictions that really didn't tell you what the Holocaust was. They were so busy trying not to tell you about the Holocaust, but trying to place you in that space where he was in a concentration camp. You came out of it not knowing anything. When I was 17, Sidney Bernstein's A Painful Reminder came out as a documentary on TV. That was a cultural moment in the UK. I remember when it was played, it was a time when there was still just 4 channels or something, 3 channels, and everybody watched it. And it was really a reckoning. It was probably in late 80s. This documentary came out, and I remember sitting waiting for this to come on the TV because so desperate were we to understand what had happened during the Holocaust. We still at that point, a documentary coming out that took you into the camps in 1945 was a cultural moment in England. And so there James and I were in 1991 walking into Yad Vashem as Christian people about to spend the entire day confronting the Holocaust. Wasn't for the first time. I'd started reading, and because of my interest in theology and actually specifically Holocaust theology, I had enough grounding. But this was the first time walking into this memorial. This was at a time when Yad Vashem is not the expansive place that it is today. It was a dark, foreboding museum in which we walked through these dark corridors. And I remember thinking that I was entering a sacred space of the Jewish community, a dark, sacred space of the Jewish community in which I was a guest, looking into the terror of that suffering. And I remember walking around, and that image that we've all seen of the woman holding her child being shot at close range was one of those moments. Walking around that museum, she was life-size at the end of a corridor, and I remember turning to my brother, or maybe he turned to me and said, that's not okay in the 20th century. Who is the person with the gun? What education did they have? Did they graduate high school? Did they have a degree? They're in uniform and they're shooting a defenseless woman with her child. That is not okay. We turned the corner and we were in another corridor. Now, James was studying medicine. I'd just finished studying theology. And we were both drawn to images. James was drawn to an image of the Nazi doctors. And he turned to me and he said, how is it that I just spent 13 weeks studying in a medical school in the UK, a course on medical ethics, and nobody raised the Nazi doctors in 13 weeks? We studied, I don't know, whatever the issues were there, abortion and termination, IVF, whatever they were in 1991. And he's looking at these images of the medical experiments. Meanwhile, I'm looking at the images of clerics with their arms raised in a Heil Hitler. And I turned to him and said, look at this. Here are these Christian clerics with their arm raised in a Heil Hitler. What is going on here? How is it I've just spent 4 years studying for an undergraduate degree in Christian theology? There's been no course about the Holocaust, and all of my year group are going to be going into the cloth to be clergy in the church without knowing that this happened, without knowing that the implications of this are that it looks like Christianity saved itself institutionally in the Nazi period at the expense of its moral credibility for all time. And where does that leave all of us? We realized in that moment that the Holocaust happened to the Jews, but was not the making of the Jews, and questioned why was it that we had to come to Israel to walk into this hallowed space in order to be confronted by something that happened in West European civilization, and that the genocide of the Jews was the making of West European civilization. And yet the Jews have to tell the story, write the books, build the museums. We sat on a bench on the Avenue of the Righteous among the olive trees that represent the people who had rescued Jews during the Holocaust, and we realized that therein lay the most important lesson, that there were people at that time who were prepared to risk their lives to save others. And there was one taxi waiting, and he pips his horn as if to say, come on, let's go already. So we get in the car and we leave. We drive up the hillside. And the taxi driver says, so what are you talking about? What's so serious? We said, we've just been in Yad Vashem. What do you think is serious? He said, yeah, but you guys were very intent. And we said, well, in conversation. And this is how I know this milestone on life's journey was so clear on that day. I told him what we'd just seen in Yad Vashem and said to him, there isn't a memorial museum in Europe today where you can go and ask the question, why? Why did it happen here? And what are we going to do about that? So there are concentration camps and death camps where they have preserved museums. But where is the place that questions West European civilization's culpability itself? There needs to be a museum in Europe, and it shouldn't come from the Jewish community. It needs to come from West European civilization itself. And it needs to ask the question, how did we fail so badly? Why did it happen? And how are we going to make sure that things change? We arrive at the lights at the bottom of Herzl Boulevard. I remember exactly where we were. And the driver turns around, and his name, I'll remember to this day, is Josh Turgeman. And thank you, Josh. Turned around and said to me and my brother, you do it.